Oh please, just one more chapter. It's a plea as old as, well, as old as what? When did we come up with the idea that a prose narrative could usefully be divided into parts? How did resting points, cliffhangers, switches in scene or narrative voice come to seem necessary and natural in books? And which writers have been most inventive in playing with the creative possibilities offered by chapters and chaptering? I'm Professor Helen Smith from the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and this is a history of chapters. Chapters are an example of what the great theorist of book bits Gerard Genette calls paratexts, all the parts of a book that are not the text itself, but that transform a string of words into a book, a thing in the world. These include cover illustrations and blurbs, titles, including chapter titles, dedications and acknowledgements, and much, much more. They must surely include chapters, not essential to a book by any means, but a convention that tells us more than we might realise about the volume we're holding or clicking through and shapes our reading experience in subtle and surprising ways. Because that is a key feature of a paratext for Genette. It is something that takes hold of and directs the reader. It does at least some of the work of telling us how to read, even if we often resist or redirect those instructions. Few paratexts can be as coercive in one sense as a chapter. In a work of fiction, we've all surely felt the urge to push on to the end of a chapter before we insert our bookmark and call it a night, only to face the allure of the next chapter, possibly the one after that. And we might be less inclined to confess it, but I'm guessing most of us have leafed forward through the pages to determine if we can make it quite to the end of this chapter, or if the need for a break or a cup of tea or the toilet is more pressing than the bulk of the pages will allow. Books, some books at least, have been divided into chapters of a kind for more than 2,000 years. The word chapter harks back to the Latin capitulum, a diminutive of caput or head, the head of a plant perhaps, or the capital of a column. It's a fun connection given how prevalent architectural fancies are in our thinking about books. Think of the famous pillars marking the edge of knowledge on the frontispiece to Francis Bacon's Instauratio Magna, or the fabulous, implausible pair of columns that front the 15th century Ferrarini Codex. Books like to think of themselves as being like buildings, or at least their authors and designers like to think of them that way, so why not think of chapters as the pillars that support a glorious whole? Remember too that the capitulum is the little decorative bit at the top of a column, so a chapter is less a block of text in its origins than a header, a way of marking out or titling different sections. All of this might seem a long way from that other meaning of capitulum, the head of a plant, but there's a closer connection than you might think, since when books aren't imagining themselves as buildings, they like to consider themselves as gardens. A florilegium is a medieval compilation of extracts from other writings, the choicest flowers plucked from other people's gardens, as it were. And florilegia were exactly the kind of books that, during the medieval period, asked to be divided into sections, with headers relating to the different topics on which you might want to collect other people's wisdom. Love, women, melancholy, the law, and so on. So the chapter or section marker goes back a long way. We can't be sure how far exactly, but a set of bronze fragments which date to around the 2nd century BCE, the Tabula Bambina, are divided throughout by a series of headers, set off from the end of the previous section by a short intervening space and telling the reader the topic of the text that follows. Not quite chapters as we know them then, but certainly an ambition to divide the text into parts and to highlight for readers what topic each section contains, using the space of the page, or of the bronze tablet in this case, to make sure the reader in a hurry can easily scan through and pick out key divisions and subjects. Thinking primarily about more modern texts from the medieval period on and with a strong emphasis on the 19th century, Gerard Genette divides chapter titles into two categories, the rhematic and the thematic. Rhematic chapters, numbered chapters, he suggests, offer straightforward breaks between sections, while thematic titles, titles relating to content, do something to the story or locate a reader more fully in the book. To Genette's simple division, and inspired by the early examples we've just been thinking about, we might add topical chapter divisions, divisions that locate information are related to but not necessarily the same as thematic chapters that lay out one of the central concerns of the book. Now, many early writers used the word capitulum to describe those subject-driven section headers, giving us a clear etymological link through to modern chapters. The habit persisted into the era of printed books, like the popular Dives and Pauper, a narrative of the Ten Commandments printed by Richard Pinson in 1493. Summarising the content of the book for readers, Pinson gives us: rich and poor have like coming into this world and like outgoing, but their living in the world is unlike. What should comfort a poor man against grudging, and what wickedness follow lovers of riches? The first chapter. And then his table of contents goes on. Of 3 manner lordships, and of which lordship is understood that God gave man lordship over fishes, birds and beasts, short for capitulum, 2. So for Pinson and his readers, chapter and capitulum seem almost interchangeable, 2 words to describe the same function, with the relatively novel English word chapter given pride of place up there in describing chapter 1, but collapsed thereafter into the familiar abbreviated Latin of ca for capitulum. It's noticeable that Pinson starts his chapters with the content, or rather starts his table of contents with the content of each chapter, followed by the chapter number. We get first a description of the message of or takeaway from the chapter, then we find out what number of chapter it is in, although they're sequential in a way that lets readers follow through straightforwardly and easily. This is an inversion of what we today think of as the usual practice, where the chapter number appears before the chapter title, if indeed in contemporary fiction there is any chapter title at all. You can also see that Pinson uses a special symbol, a capitula, which you might also know as the pilcrow or paragraph mark. In medieval manuscripts, scribes frequently used capitula to mark out each new unit of text, a habit that carried forward into the early years of print. Claiborne tells us a bit more about these in her brilliant book on typographies of performance. Pilcrows, another name for capitula, were used at first to mark the beginnings of chapters or arguments, but they soon came to mark even smaller units of reading. The increasingly frequent appearance of pilcrows in 12th and 13th century manuscripts resulted from the growing demand for scholastic texts that required of their readers a newly ratiocinative scrutiny. Scribes began to make room on the page for pilcrows to create divisions within longer sections of text that could help readers readily identify the principal stages in an argument. So pilcrows let scribes cut up units of content in a way that let readers have easy navigation, easy reference, and easy access to their books. Other early writers had different words for these section heads, calling them argumenta or tituli, imagining them either as summaries of a book's argument or as something closer to the thematic chapter titles of today. So in 1387, when John of Trevisa, who we'll meet again a little later, translated Ranulph Higden's ambitious universal history, the Polychronicon, he translated Higden's Latin tituli as titles. For to come to clear and full knowledge of that land, he said, these titles that followeth, meaning these chapters that followeth, openeth the way. Rather than buildings or flowers, this is a metaphor of exploration, the chapter as pathfinder, guide through a baffling and alien country. Though we perhaps associate chapters most closely with fiction, an assertion that might fall flat depending on your discipline and requirements as a reader, early chaptered books were books of facts. Cato the Elder on farming, Pliny on natural history. Chapters, or headings at least, were a way of dividing up the text, telling the reader where to find the thing they required, the specifics of what each section was going to talk about. Titles of this kind probably survive most obviously now in textbooks and other non-fiction genres. They often map to other modes of classification, types of dinosaur, for example, or genera of whales, geographical region, class of substance, parts of a car. We might think about how even the most mundane of chapter divisions can build up to form a story of sorts. What is the first thing a reader needs to know? Does the book move chronologically? Does it build from parts to whole, atoms to the universe? Does it move from the simple to the complex, from histories to innovations, past to future? In subtle, and sometimes not so subtle ways, the ordering of chapter directs our understanding of what is important and how things fit together. To take one example, Book 10 of a 1580 edition of a sprawling medieval encyclopedia, Bartholomeus Anglicus's De Proprietatibus Rerum, on the properties of things, newly titled Batman upon Bartolom, deals with matter, the stuff of the world. Within a larger scheme in which Book 1 of this mammoth text deals with angels, and the whole book works its way down to the mundane stuff of the world in the final book, eggs, flour, weights and measures, each set of chapters also tells a story of descent through categories. Chapter 1 of Book 10 offers an overview of matter and form, the shaping, constitutive stuff of the universe and of the world. Chapter 2 treats of form itself. Chapter 3 moves down to talk about the elements which were understood to make up all of this matter and substance. Chapter 4 dealt with fire, one of the elements. 5 with fire's specific shape as flame. 6 with smoke. 7 with coal. 8 with a spark. 9 and 10 with ashes. This is a taxonomy of degradation, a story for readers of the glories of the universe and the gritty material realities of the world. It's easy, from everything I've said, to see that chapters share a genealogy with indexes. Both are ways of trying to make sense of a big wad of text. Both are ways of trying to give the reader multiple entry points into a mass of information. As William Baldwin explained to readers of his A Treatise of Moral Philosophy containing the sayings of the wise, published in 1547, he had gathered together a selection of proverbs and sundered them into chapters, he says, that they might the easier be had and found out for all manner purposes. Chapters are there to let you get to grips with the bit of the text that you need. So like the index, the capitulum or chapter is an aid to what Peter Stalibras, a leading scholar of books and their histories, calls discontinuous reading. Stalibras argues that the ability to flick from one section of a text to another, to find your way to a precise portion of a book at speed, to dive in at the point you need to access most urgently, were all made newly possible and radically possible by the advent of the codex, the kind of book you navigate by opening and turning the pages rather than by unfurling it as in a scroll. In this sense, remarks Stalibras, the history of the codex is the history of the bookmark, or perhaps the history of the chapter. Batman upon Bartolome, which gained its peculiar title because it was edited by a man called Stephen Batman, a clergyman and author, was the final hurrah for a text that had had a long previous life. De Proprietatibus Rerum had been printed late in the previous century, the 15th century, by Caxton's successor Wynkyn de Worde, and it was based on a translation of Bartholomeus' Latin text that had been made by John of Trevisa, him again, in the 13th century. Here is an image from de Worde's beautiful edition, which carries over from Trevisa's translation the thrill of the chapter as something that might need to be introduced or explained to readers. Ye shall understand that in these 18 books ensuing been 1098 chapters. That is to say, in the second book of Bartholomew de Proprietatibus Rerum been 20 chapters, all the third book been 24 chapters, the fourth book containeth 21 chapters, and so on. It's a lovely example that takes us to a moment in the 13th century when the idea of books divided into chapters was still enough of a novelty to make it remarkable. Which brings us neatly to a crucial moment, or a pair of crucial moments, in the history of chapters and chaptering. Nicholas Dames, the preeminent scholar of the chapter, suggests that it was St. Jerome who first used the term capitulum to refer to a numbered, titled section of text, and that was during the late 3rd or early 4th century BCE. Jerome used the term capitulum to refer to numbered chapter headings. The index capitulorum was his term for the table of contents. Now, Jerome was a priest, famously responsible for translating most of the Bible into Latin, a version known as the Vulgate. But the Vulgate was different from the Bible readers know today in a number of significant ways, including in its chaptering. The chapters of the Bible as we know them now were the product not of Hebrew scribes, but of an English cleric, Stephen Langton, who would go on to become Archbishop of Canterbury. Throughout late antiquity and into the medieval period, Bibles contained numerous different chaptering systems, making it extraordinarily hard to compare between versions and readings. In the early years of the 13th century, Langton was teaching in Paris, where he produced an influential breakdown of the Bible into its parts. As students left Paris, they carried Langton's particular system with them, and from roughly the 1220s onwards, the Parisian scriptoria, sites at which staggering numbers of Bibles were copied out by hand, began to incorporate Langton's system, making it ubiquitous and the root of the system we still use now. One Bible, produced in England and now held in the Bibliothèque Municipale de Lyon, has at the top of the pages of Genesis and of Proverbs. This book is divided into chapters according to Master S, Archbishop of Canterbury, a celebration of the Archbishop's role in dividing up the Bible and a testament to how much people thought about chapters, the technology of it, and the utility of splitting the Bible into chapter and verse. The breaking down of the Bible was another element of the discontinuous reading that I've talked about, described by St. Peter Stalibras. With the parts of the Bible nearly comparable in the main across translations, versions and editions, readers could quite literally cite the Bible chapter and verse, finding their place with remarkable precision. As my colleague at York, Kevin Killeen, notes, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the moment at which this Bible was produced, this had led to much agreement, but also to significant discord, with opportunistic, discontinuous readers accused of chopping the Bible into pieces to serve their ends. So as we've seen, chapters were already a staple before print arrived in England. They thrived in the era of print as authors, printers and booksellers sought ways to make books ever more navigable to readers. William Caxton, England's first printer, was a fan of chapters. He divided the Morte d'Arthur into chapters, for example, in 1485, giving readers a set of ways to navigate this lengthy romance text. But during this period, chapters still didn't belong primarily to prose fiction. Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, Lady Mary Roth's Urania are two examples of gruelling, lengthy prose narratives that saw no need for division into chapters, making for daunting reading experiences for any reader. Other writers, though, embraced the specificity allowed by chaptering and especially by chapter titles. As with book titles in the 16th and 17th centuries, many chapter titles were extraordinary in their length and detail. The minister Samuel Purchas, for example, started his Microcosmos of the History of Man, published in 1619, cheerfully enough, with a chapter titled "The Alphabet of Divine Learnings begins with the cross of the true knowledge of man's self," before launching into one chapter after another, all designed to compare man to something in the world and show the vanity of all things and the uselessness of man in the face of the cosmos. Chapter 4 gives us Man, a Little World, the correspondence betwixt him and the greater world, but by the time we get to chapter 39, we're faced with the title Man vanished into smoke, darkness, tempestuous clouds, water, froth, vapours, sleep, dreams, a tale, a shadow, nothing, less than nothing. With titles this detailed on this narrative, who needs to bother reading the chapters themselves? One reader certainly did pay attention to the question of chapters when engaging with Purchas's book. In the copy of Purchas's text that's held in the University of Illinois Library, that reader has written a list down the side of the table of contents, detailing how many pages there are in each chapter. It's not clear why they did this. Were they daunted by the sheer scale of Purchas's relentless text? A big fan of evenly divided chapters? Keen to know how many pages they had to get through in a sitting, perhaps, if they were reading the book one chapter at a time. Along with chapters and chapter headings came the running head or running title, the little summary text that runs along the top of a book's pages. Running titles are present in many of the earliest surviving Latin manuscripts. You can easily tell that they have a similar function to the chapter heading. If you're searching for a chapter, they frequently help you to find it, without needing to track it down via the table of contents or land exactly on its opening page. We usually expect running titles to give us little or nothing more than an author name or a chapter title, if that. As Jeanette notes, these are, in theory, simply reminders of where a reader is and how a text is divided, and very often we ignore them entirely. Frequently enough, in contemporary fiction especially, they're simply left out. But sometimes, Jeanette notes, running heads transcend this role and play their own part, surreptitiously giving a title to a chapter that is in theory untitled, or by highlighting details that change from page to page, variable running heads, or by playing a tune that differs from that of the chapter's official intertitle. In 16th and 17th century books, running titles were sometimes hyper-specific, breaking down every chapter into its constituent parts. John Bernard's book, The Tranquillity of the Mind, published in 1580, apologised to his beloved reader that this treatise be not of those sort of books which are usually divided into chapters either short or long. Yet, he went on, as well by notes in the margin as also by the titles above the head of every leaf, you are no less plainly directed to every particular matter therein. Here's a peculiar moment, and not a unique one, where an author knows that readers find chapters helpful as a way to navigate, but hasn't provided them, and instead uses the technology of the marginal note and the running title to stand in for chapters and help a reader to their place in the text. As Matthew Day points out, running titles did far more than merely repeat the title of a work in the 16th and 17th centuries. They interpreted it, and did so in a variety of different ways. Day gives us the example of a book titled, wait for it, A Certain Relation of the Hog-Faced Gentlewoman called Mistress Tanniken Skinker, who was born at Workham, a neuter town between the Emperor and the Hollander, situate on the river Rhine, who was bewitched in her mother's womb in the year 1618, and hath lived ever since unknown in this kind to any but her parents and a few other neighbours, and can never recover her true shape till she be married, etc., also relating the cause as it is conceived, how her mother came to be so bewitched. The book's running title gives us a lot less and cuts to the chase, A Relation of the Woman Monster. Andrea Levy's Small Island, first published in 2004, gives us a nice example of an instructive modern use of running heads. The chapter titles are simple, the numbers followed by the name of the speaker. Prologue, Queenie, 1, Hortense, 2, Gilbert, and so on. But the book is also divided into sections, switching back and forth between 1948 and before. And it's those divisions that are captured in the running titles, which run along the tops of the pages, switching us between the specifically located moment of a year in Britain and the capacious formative before time of the members of the Windrush generation who feature in Levy's brilliant novel. All of this prologue, I guess, brings us to the chapter itself. What is it that a chapter does? How have writers and readers thought about chapters, and how have they changed, in fiction at least, from utilitarian divisions to fictive spaces? As Nicholas Danes points out, chapters and chapter breaks occupy a peculiar space between continuous and discontinuous reading. They invite us in the main to imagine the text as a linear sequence, one thing after another, and never more so than when chapters in fiction are titled simply 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But they also let us imagine a book as something broken into sections, something that can be picked up and put down at places that make narrative or topical sense, something into which the reader can dip at will, finding the information or the passage they need without necessarily starting from page 1. Oddly enough, the chapter's use as a rhythmic marker or narrative division in prose fiction seems to have been born in large part from a broadly satirical urge. Miguel de Cervantes was one of the first writers to send up the chapter, playing with the concept of division by topic or sense and exploding it in the process. The chapters of his stupendous mock epic Don Quixote, published in 2 parts in 1605 and 1615, include a chapter in which is related what will be found set forth in it, one which treats of many and great things, and one which treats of matters having to do with this chapter, and none other. Not really very telling if you're a reader trying to find out what is going to happen next. Cervantes closes one chapter by reflecting, but the unfortunate thing is that the author of this history left the battle in suspense at this critical point with the excuse that he could find no more records of Don Quixote's exploits than those related here. But the author tells us those records do exist. He, the text's alleged second author, did not despair of finding the conclusion of this delightful story, and by the favour of heaven found it, as shall be told in our second part. On to the next chapter, quickly, to learn more. There, we're reminded immediately that we have left the valiant Basque and the famous Don Quixote with naked swords aloft on the point of dealing 2 such furious downward strokes as, had they struck true, would have cleft both knights asunder from head to foot and split them like pomegranates. But instead of telling us what happened next, what we really want to know, Cervantes treats us to a lengthy digression, describing this second author's search for the missing records and stringing out the suspense for a further 4 pages. This mocking model, alert to what readers look for in a chapter, alert to the narrative rhythms, alert to what we expect from a cliffhanger, alert to how one chapter is meant to follow on from another, are at once intriguing and frustrating to the reader. It was also adopted by Rabelais and numerous picaresque authors, and it set in motion a long tradition of the self-aware, playful, sometimes teasing chapter title, one that sits somewhere inside and somewhere outside the book at the same time, calling the reader's attention to the act of being a reader and asking us to think about the kinds of unwritten contract we expect to have with an author and a book. What do we know chapters are going to do for us, and what happens when they refuse to do exactly what we expect? This tradition fed into the rich milieu of the 18th century novel, that moment when prose fiction took on so many of the forms and conventions which make it recognisable to us today. Henry Fielding is one of the great artists and one of the great critics of the chapter. Fielding devotes the first chapter of the second book of his 1742 novel, the mock biography Joseph Andrews, written, as its title page tells us, in imitation of the manner of Cervantes, author of Don Quixote, so there's a clue to us already not to expect something wholly serious, to the problem of why authors divide up their books. There are, he notes, certain mysteries or secrets in all trades, from the highest to the lowest, from that of prime ministering to this of authoring. Maybe we want to invert Fielding's hierarchy today, placing authoring somewhat higher than prime ministering. They are seldom discovered, he says, unless to members of the same calling. The ignorant reader, Fielding observes, tongue-in-cheek, will conclude that authors divide their work into books and chapters only to make their books bigger and thus more expensive. But the reality, says Fielding, is that chapter breaks are inserted for the benefit of the reader, not the writer. Those little spaces between our chapters, he suggests, may be looked upon as an inn or resting place, where he may stop and take a glass or any other refreshment as it pleases him. Nay, our fine readers will perhaps be scarce able to travel farther than through one of them in a day. As to those vacant pages which are placed between our books, they are to be regarded as those stages where in long journeys the traveller stays some time to repose himself and consider of what he hath seen in the parts he hath already passed through, a consideration which I take the liberty to recommend a little to the reader. For however swift his capacity may be, I would not advise him to travel through these pages too fast, for if he doth, he may probably miss the seeing some curious productions of nature, which will be observed by the slower and more accurate reader. A volume without any such places of rest, says Fielding, resembles the opening of wilds or seas, which tires the eye and fatigues the spirit when entered upon. We're back, in a sense, to chapters as pathways and to readers as voyages. The kind of journeying imagined here is not walking or wandering, but travelling by coach with stops at convenient stages along the way. Coincidentally enough, an activity much in vogue in the 18th century and which occupies much of the narrative time of Fielding's protagonist. We're also in the territory of the sublime, the appreciation of nature's wonders that was so much in vogue in late 17th and early 18th century England, encapsulated in Joseph Addison's observation that the Alps fill the mind with an agreeable kind of horror. You're looking at something striking that fills your soul with a conception of the vastness and the wonder of all that nature has to offer. For Fielding, though, a little sublimity goes a long way. Chapter breaks offer a neat staging post at which readers can rest and recuperate after marvelling at the expanses of human nature. Humorous as it is, Fielding's attentiveness to the needs of his readers illustrates Dennis Duncan's contention that a chapter, on the whole, is a unit based on our availability as readers. What time is it reasonable to ask a reader to spend with a book at one sitting? When and where do we need a break? How can books serve the needs of those with leisure to read, but also fit into the time of those with other duties to attend to? Earlier writers had also been alert to this problem. Thomas Harding, writing in 1565, assured readers that because distinction giveth light to the matter treated and diminisheth the tediousness of the reader, every part is divided into chapters. William Allen, in 1567, praised his own initiative in including chapters, where the readers at every turning and joint of the cause may rest themselves. And Andrew Kingsmill thought his chapters were of so much service to the reader that he advertised them on the title page of his book, A View of Man's Estate, wherein the great mercy of God in man's free justification by Christ is very comfortably declared, comfortably meaning there to the comfort of readers, by Andrew Kingsmill, divided into chapters in such sort as may best serve for the commodity of the reader. Chapters here are so exciting and so useful that they have got a marketing function. You really need to read this book. It gives you places to pause and reflect. Let's head back to Fielding. Chapter divisions are also, he says, a memory aid, which prevents spoiling the beauty of a book by turning down its leaves, a method otherwise necessary to those readers who, though they read with great improvement and advantage, are apt, when they return to their study after half an hour's absence, to forget where they left off. No dog-earing is necessary when you know you made it safely to the end of chapter 11. Though we might pause here to ask how far the advance that is the chapter goes hand in hand with the technological marvel that is the bookmark. Do we rely on remembering which chapter we've just passed through? Or, especially as we get older and our memory for fiction, as for all things, gets a little less robust, do we rely on a convenient tool to hold our place for us and bring us back to the book at the point we left off? Chapters have a narrative or selective function too, insists Fielding. What are the contents prefixed to every chapter but so many inscriptions over the gates of inns, to continue the same metaphor, informing the reader what entertainment he is to expect, which, if he likes not, he may travel on to the next. Imagine the 18th century equivalent of the pavement chalkboard, an advertisement pasted up outside a public house telling you that you can enjoy singing, for instance, or bowls or other sports. That's what Fielding is offering the reader, a long, discursive chapter title that gives you a foretaste of the delights or terrors you're about to enjoy. A night scene, for example, wherein several wonderful adventures befell Mr. Adams and his fellow travellers, Book 3, Chapter 2, or Book 3, Chapter 9, containing as surprising and bloody adventures as can be found in this or perhaps any other authentic history. Knowing what a chapter contains, Fielding points out, means you can decide how important it is. This applies more to some kind of books than others. For, in biography, and remember we're talking about a mock biography here, as we are not tied down to an exact concatenation equally with other historians, so a chapter or two, for instance this I am now writing, may be often passed over without any injury to the whole. This is characteristically sly from Fielding, waiting until you're halfway through a chapter about chaptering before pointing out that you would lose little or nothing if you chose not to read it at all. In passing, Fielding takes a shot at other authors, promising that his own chapters do what they say on the tin, or rather in the chapter title. He has chosen fidelity rather than imitating the celebrated Montaigne, who promises you one thing and gives you another, nor some title page authors who promise a great deal and produce nothing at all. As always, Fielding is not being entirely serious. His chapter headings are many things, but blandly descriptive is rarely one of them. Some are straightforward enough, though intriguing. What happened after their journey to London, for instance, being very full of adventures which succeeded each other at the inn, or a very short chapter in which Parson Adams went a great way. Others are more playful, in which, after some very fine writing, the history goes on and relates the interview between the lady and Joseph, where the latter hath set an example which we despair of seeing followed by his sex in this vicious age, for instance. What we have in this particular example is Fielding's satire when it comes to the growing vogue for extracts or anthologies of fine writing or scenes from literature that marked the 18th and 19th centuries. This trend was a descendant of the medieval florilegium, a precursor of the contemporary anthology. As Leah Price has pointed out, the genre came into fashion in the 18th and 19th centuries as readers, or rather publishers, sought out particularly fine passages of elegant prose at which to marvel, rather like the grand scenes that might be enjoyed by members of a touring coach party. So Fielding both mocks and brings his reader in on the joke by promising particularly good writing, something that's already marked out in the chapter title as worth sharing, worth dwelling on, worth extracting, and worth anthologising. In an innovation that fits neatly with this tradition, the extraordinarily popular Gothic writer Anne Radcliffe started the practice of replacing chapter titles with a chapter number twinned with a verse epigraph on a relevant theme in the late 18th century. She published The Romance of the Forest in 1791. Each chapter has a number and then a snippet of verse for the reader to enjoy and reflect on before they move into the chapter itself. As my colleague here at York, James Williams, points out, the novel is subtitled Interspersed with Some Pieces of Poetry. This is something promised to the reader on the title page. So there's a sense in which Radcliffe's novel imagines itself as a kind of anthology, setting the scene for each chapter with a snippet of verse for the reader to ponder and enjoy. Back to Fielding for the last time. Many of his chapter titles baffle and provoke rather than satisfying the imagination. Try A Very Delightful Adventure, as well to the persons concerned as to the good-natured reader, for one, or Of Several New Matters Not Expected, a chapter title whose Cervantian heritage is very evident. In Tom Jones, published in 1749, one chapter heading reads only Containing Little or Nothing, another containing 5 pages of paper, another containing the space of 12 days, and a fourth containing what the reader may perhaps expect to find in it. As Jeanette notes, all the titles in this novel are quote-worthy. Whatever he claims as his theory of chapter breaks as moments of rest and respite, Fielding's practice in his chapter titles and the chapter themselves is both provocative and entertaining, baffling the reader and drawing us on. Following in the footsteps of Cervantes and Fielding, Laurence Sterne plays fast and loose with chapters and chaptering in his famously absurd and experimental novel Tristram Shandy, published between 1759 and 1767. Volume 5, Chapter 2, for instance, ends with a long dash, a typographical feature of which Sterne was inordinately fond, leading us forward from the end of the sentence, "How my father went on, in my opinion, deserves a chapter to itself." And Chapter 3 duly begins with a hail of dashes and the pledge, "And a chapter it shall have, and a devil of one too. So look to yourselves." Imagine to yourself, the narrator invites us towards the end of one chapter before reconsidering. But this had better begin a new chapter. The next chapter duly follows. Imagine to yourself a little squat, uncourtly figure of a Dr. Slop of about 4.5 feet perpendicular height. Volume 3, Chapter 76, launches optimistically but quickly concludes, "I begin the chapter over again," and our narrator, Tristram, immediately does just that in Chapter 77. Book 2, Chapter 5 closes with Dr. Slop just beginning to return my Uncle Toby the compliment of his or interjectional whistle when the door hastily opening in the next chapter but 1 put an end to the affair. This is a play, of course, on the temporality of chapters and the novel as a whole. If something is interrupted in a novel, it's supposed to be interrupted here and now, not in 2 chapters' time. Sterne's book also jumps over an entire chapter, supposed to have contained a section of Tristram's European voyage. Our narrator, Tristram, reflecting upon this excised chapter, laments, "The painting of this journey, upon reviewing it, appears to be so much above the style and manner of anything else I have been able to paint in this book, that it could not have remained in it without depreciating every other scene, and destroying at the same time that necessary equipoise and balance, whether of good or bad, betwixt chapter and chapter, from whence the just proportion and harmony of the whole work results." The chapter, in other words, was too good to keep, making a mockery of the vogue for admiring and extracting particularly extraordinary passages of prose that I explored in my own previous chapter. In Volume 2, Tristram twice promises us a forthcoming chapter on buttonholes. At various other moments, the novel refers back to the chapter as though we've already read it, and yet the chapter itself doesn't exist. In Volume 2 again, Chapter 44, Tristram cries out in despair, "Have not I promised the world a chapter of knots? 2 chapters upon the right and the wrong end of a woman, a chapter of noses. No, I have done that. A chapter upon my Uncle Toby's modesty, to say nothing of a chapter upon chapters, which I will finish before I sleep. By my great-grandfather's whiskers, I shall never get half of them through this year." What then of that promised chapter on chapters? It is, predictably enough, neither enlightening nor devoted to its promised subject. Is it not a shame, the chapter begins, to make 2 chapters of what passed in going down 1 pair of stairs? Reflecting on the apparent arbitrariness with which an author chooses where to cut the text, Tristram laments, "I can no more help it than my destiny. A sudden impulse comes across me. Drop the curtain, Shandy. I drop it. Strike a line here across the paper, Tristram. I strike it. And hey for a new chapter." This, of course, brings into view how carefully most chapter divisions are considered, that the chapter builds to a certain point before we cut away and move to something that makes a certain kind of logical sense of one kind or another. And Tristram also muddles his metaphors, or rather, he starts metaphorically imagining himself as a stagehand or theatre director dropping the curtain after a vivid scene, but he ends in some sense literally, thinking about an authorial practice of drawing a line under a chapter to mark it as a finished unit. Tristram wraps up his wisdom on chapters in a self-cancelling passage that leaves the reader none the wiser as to whether any wisdom has been imparted or not. Laying out his plan to tell the world all I knew about the matter at once, Tristram asks, "Is not this 10 times better than to set out dogmatically with a sententious parade of wisdom and telling the world a story of a roasted horse, that chapters relieve the mind, that they assist or impose upon the imagination, and that in a work of this dramatic cast they are as necessary as the shifting of scenes, with 50 other cauld conceits, enough to extinguish the fire which roasted him?" These are all possible ways of interpreting what chapters might be and do, but Tristram doesn't allow us to relax or to be secure in any of them. What Shandy tells us is only what we should not think about chapters. And that is all we learn about chapters from the chapter on chapters, which, Tristram declares, I hold to be the best chapter in my whole work, and take my word, whoever reads it is full as well employed as in picking straws, which is to say, scarcely at all. Let's hop forward then, roughly 100 years into the middle of the 19th century. William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, first published as a 19-part monthly serial from 1847 to 1848, is sometimes described as the founder of the Victorian domestic novel, though it's an interesting and a shape-shifting text in its own right. Each of its published parts contains several chapters, and the novel sits in a kind of middle ground, looking back to the playful, hyper-self-conscious chaptering of Fielding and Sterne, but looking forward as well to the more abbreviated chapter titles of the later 19th century. Novelists of the 1830s and 1840s, Nicholas Dane suggests, frequently chose much briefer chapter titles, ones that promised a great deal under only 1 or 2 words, but seldom gave the reader much of an idea of what exactly was to come. Sir Walter Scott's Quentin Durward, for example, starts with Chapter 1, The Contrast, Chapter 2, The Wanderer, Chapter 3, The Castle, titles that give the reader a good hint of mood, tone, perhaps genre, but very little sense of the action or direction of any given chapter. And, Dames points out, chapter breaks grow less frequent too, occurring only about half as often, or after twice as many pages, as in 18th century novels. The average 18th century chapter was, he says, roughly 1,750 words long, the average Victorian chapter roughly 3,500. If you think it's harder work to sit down with a big Victorian blockbuster, there you are, in some very real sense, right. So Thackeray's Vanity Fair offers us several good old-fashioned 18th century style chapter titles. Chapter 12, quite a sentimental chapter. Chapter 25, in which all the principal personages think fit to leave Brighton. Chapter 44, a roundabout chapter between London and Hampshire. Chapter 64, a vagabond chapter. None of these, I think, would present too much of a direct challenge to a reader steeped in the tradition of Fielding and Sterne. And there are titles, of course, that play with the form of the novel and the self-consciousness of author and reader, as we might expect. There's chapter 36, How to Live Well on Nothing a Year, followed by chapter 37, The Subject Continued, stringing out its topic in the same way as Thackeray's subjects, the Crawleys, string out their scarce resources through using other people's generosity. We've got chapter 49, in which we enjoy 3 courses and a dessert, chapter 51, in which a charade is acted, which may or may not puzzle the reader. But we also have a handful of titles that evoke the shorter, more emblematic or tonal chapter titles of the late 19th century. Chapter 47, Gaunt House, chapter 59, The Old Piano, chapter 62, Am Rhine, to the Rhine. Each type of chapter title presents a different kind of puzzle to the reader. These ones, though short, are richly suggestive, packed with indications of sentiment and offering the reader a sense of each chapter as a gleaming, significant scene. Thackeray is also more than happy to enter into the tradition of the meta-chapter, the chapter which ponders the status of chapters. Chapter 6, Vauxhall, about a proposal intended to take place in Vauxhall Gardens that never does, is, our narrator tells us, so short that it scarce deserves to be called a chapter at all. A very short distance into this non-chapter, which is not in fact noticeably short, Thackeray interrupts his narrative to reflect on the everyday, somewhat humdrum nature of his story. I know that the tune I am piping is a very mild one, although there are some terrific chapters coming presently, and must beg the good-natured reader to remember that we are only discoursing at present about a stockbroker's family in Russell Square, who are taking walks or luncheon or dinner or talking and making love as people do in common life, and without a single passionate and wonderful incident to mark the progress of their loves. What Thackeray does is to seize on the break or respite offered by the end of a chapter and burrow into that space, pausing with the reader and inviting the reader to pause with him to reflect upon the pace and shape of the novel. This is something that George Eliot also does, albeit in a very different way. Chapter 17 of Adam Bede, published in 1859, is titled In Which the Story Pauses a Little. It is not just the break between chapters here, but chapter 17 itself, which offers readers a moment out from the march of narrative and encourages them to reflect on the possibility of dwelling within a chapter, as well as within the spaces between it. In the Vauxhall chapter, Thackeray reflects on the shape of what might have been, briefly conjuring alternative storylines and acknowledging we should easily have constructed a tale of thrilling interest through the fiery chapters of which the reader should hurry, panting. There's an interesting comment about the pace of chapters, how one chapter might push or pull you through it, how another might give you space and leisure to breathe and reflect. The chapter to come, he confesses, contains no scenes of comic brilliance, nor terrifying accounts of murder and kidnap. And yet, it is a chapter, he says, and a very important one too. Are not there little chapters in everybody's life that seem to be nothing and yet affect all the rest of the history? What Thackeray puts his finger on here is the difference between chapters structured around moments of narrative tension and the realities of everyday life that unfold, as he remarks, in gentler ways, and whose significance may not be realised in the moment, though it certainly, in this case, sets our heroine, or anti-heroine, Rebecca Sharp, firmly on her fictive trajectory. Many other 19th century writers continued to experiment as well with the form and possibilities of chapters, even if some, like Jane Austen, resolutely refused to mark them out with anything but a number. Dickens, for instance, cheekily titled chapter 16 of the Pickwick Papers, Too Full of Adventure to be Briefly Described, while the first chapter of David Copperfield is titled I Am Born. Lewis Carroll ends chapter 11 of Alice in Wonderland with Alice watching the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. For they haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name Alice. Chapter 12. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting. The joke is that this is not what a chapter break is supposed to do. There is meant to be some break in the scene, some gap, some shift, not an immediate continuation, as here, of exactly what has gone before. And it's all part of Carol's game of playing with the shape of the book, our expectations of story, and a world turned upside down, or rather back to front. Over in Paris, Victor Hugo, who found writing notoriously difficult, began very modestly as he chaptered his earlier works, but he became more and more experimental as he went. Les Miserables, Jeanette tells us, is of unsurpassed diversity in its lack of restraint. The book has 5 parts, divided into 48 books and 365 chapters. But, notes Jeanette, because the books and the parts also have their own titles, no opportunity should be missed, we end up, unless I've miscounted, with 418 titles in all, propelled by an obvious frenzy of playfulness. Though Jeanette suggests that no sample could evoke the book's flamboyant proliferation, I offer you a handful of examples. Volume 1, Chapter 7, the traveller on his arrival takes precautions for departure. Volume 2, Book 1, Chapter 4, just A. Chapter 9 of the same book, A Bad Guide to Napoleon, A Good Guide to Below. Volume 4, Book 1, Chapter 1, Well Cut. Chapter 2, Badly Sewed. The last chapter of all, Volume 5, Book 9, Chapter 6, The Grass Covers and the Rain Effaces. The man certainly knew how to finish a book in the end. Now, not all authors felt the need to have a creative hand in the gaps and breaks of their text, and this example brings into view the possibility of the ways in which printers and publishers have had their own say in how books should be divided, as well, of course, in more recent years as editors. We know, for instance, thanks to Josie Billington, that Elizabeth Gaskell left it up to her publisher to decide what to title each chapter, even sometimes to decide where the chapter divisions should be put. So the chapter offers a promise to the reader. The next chapter, one more chapter. There is content, sometimes story, still to come, as long as there are chapters still to read. Chapters can represent promise to the writer too, but they can also present a challenge. At the head of the paper was inscribed Chapter 3, the narrator of George Gissing's 1891 novel New Grub Street tells us, focused on the plight of the hack writer Mr. Reardon. But that was all. The writer knows that a novel needs chapters. A new chapter offers a kind of freedom, but it's also a daunting obstacle sometimes to inspiration and writerly flow, suggesting the way in which the form of the novel, its materiality, its heft, its presence in the world, is already there for the writer before they sit down to write. You know that a book needs chapters, you know that you must go on and write the next one, and if you're poor Mr. Reardon, struggling to write to make money for your starving family, you struggle to find the way to get that next chapter out and onto the page. The problems and the possibilities of chapters did not go away with the advent of the 20th century. The narrator of Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, published in 1947, puzzles over the problem of where and how to divide his text. As with earlier sections, I would do better not to give this one its own number, but to identify it as properly belonging to the previous chapter as its continuation. The right thing would be to forge ahead without any deep caesura, for this is still the chapter entitled The World, the chapter about my late friend's relationship or lack of relationship within the world. But what creates a gap more than stopping to reflect on the shape of chapters? What creates more of a break or caesura than pausing to consider whether there should be a break at all? Numerous other writers in the 20th and 21st centuries have also played with chapters and their prospects. Giulio Cortázar, for instance, created a table of instructions to preface his 1966 novel Hopscotch, suggesting different sequences in which the chapters might be read. Think about this as one version of those choose-your-own-adventure novels that were popular when I was a child, in which a series of short chapters led in numerous possible directions, though seldom in good or satisfying ones. B.S. Johnson also had a go at something along these lines, creating a box set novel, The Unfortunates, published in 1969. Each chapter in this novel comes separately bound. The first and last are marked out. We know how the novel is supposed to begin, we know how it must end. But the idea is that every other chapter is to be read in whatever order the reader chooses, and they can be manipulated, shuffled, and attempted again. And of course, there's Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, in which the chapter titles, well, if I tell you any more, it counts as a spoiler. You just have to read that one and see. But even as chapter headings have dwindled in the modern novel, you'll find many novels in which there's no chapter titles at all, simply numbers, or even simply blank sections of page, marking out the fact that there is some kind of break, but giving no signal as to how we're to interpret it, or what kind of change or what kind of shift that break represents. Some writers have kept their traditions alive, often in the mode of homage or pastiche. So Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose has it both ways. It has brief chapter titles which track the rhythms of the monastic day, but they're followed by detailed descriptions of the chapter contents. One of the first Vespers chapter, for example, is followed by a description which tells us in which the rest of the abbey is visited, William comes to some conclusions about Adelma's death, there is a conversation with the brother glazier about glasses for reading and about phantoms for those who seek to read too much. Or one chapter of Night, in which Salvatore allows himself to be discovered wretchedly by Bernard Gui, the girl loved by Azzo is arrested as a witch, and all go to bed more unhappy and worried than before. John Barth's The Sopweed Factor looks back very overtly to Fielding and Co., with chapters like 1. The poet is introduced and differentiated from his fellows. 2. The remarkable manner in which Ebenezer was educated and the no less remarkable results of that education. 3. Ebenezer is rescued and here's a diverting tale involving Isaac Newton and other notables. 4. Ebenezer's first sojourn in London and the issue of it. 5. Ebenezer commences his second sojourn in London and fares unspectacularly, and so on. Some books, of course, Lucy Ellmann's Ducks, Newburyport, Flann O'Brien's Swim Two Birds, abandon chapters altogether. Flann O'Brien's book starts at chapter 1, but just keeps going, never ever switching to chapter 2. Ellmann's massive text consists of a single, astonishingly lengthy sentence, with no rest or respite spaces of any kind. And some authors, of course, play with the idea that rhematic, numbered titles might become, in some sense, thematic, tied to the narrative and the structures of the book. There's Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, whose chapters use prize numbers because a narrator, the character with autism, Christopher John Francis Boone, likes them so much. There's also Laszlo Krasznahorkai, the Hungarian writer, whose Seobo There Below has chapters numbered according to the Fibonacci sequence, spiralling us out away from the idea of linear progression that we expect with chapters numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So much for where chapters start, so much for what they do. Where do they end? How and when do we know a chapter has finished? Because it stops, of course. Perhaps because there's something satisfying in the narrative, a rise in pitch, the finishing off of an episode, a declaration from a character. This is the kind of fictive wrapping up of a chapter that we've seen Lewis Carroll mocking. A good chapter ending is just as often marked by narrative excitement, the cliffhanger that provokes that urge for just one more chapter, and then perhaps another and another, one more still, even an illicit glance at the last page. But chapter endings are also marked out in the book itself, most usually by blank space at the end of the page, but sometimes, and especially in children's chapter books, by an illustration or, in earlier books, a cul de lampe. This too is a term taken from architecture, where it means a weight-bearing piece jutting out from a wall, a corbel. It's a decorative tailpiece or pendant that marks the end of a section of text. Some form of closing shape is pretty much as old as, in some cases older than, print, especially a little grotesque or a triangle of stars marking the end of a book or marking the end of a section. From the 19th century onwards, the decorated tailpiece came in vogue, especially in the brilliant illustrations created by the woodcutter Thomas Bewick. Here is a terrifying tailpiece grown out of all proportion and marking the end of the Book of Revelation in an 1800 illustrated Bible published by Thomas Mackin. This tailpiece was designed by Philip James de Lutherberg, a French-born British painter who left a religious cult to become an artist and became known for his large naval works, his elaborate set designs for London theatre, and his own mechanical theatre, the Edo Fuzikon. Tailpieces then are a way of showing visually that the chapter has ended, and they began to play jokes or to relate thematically to the chapters and the books that they thus marked out. So back to Thackeray, author of Vanity Fair, who designed his own tailpieces along with pictorial capital letters, vignettes and full-page engravings for his novel. Chapter 9 closes with a tiny tailpiece showing a seated figure who has just removed a jester's mask. Peering out at the reader is the small, worried face of Thackeray himself, popping up here, as he does in his chapter titles and on occasion throughout his chapters, to remind us that the author is always at hand. I just mentioned chapter books, the genre of children's fiction which is the next step on from picture books, the next advance into reading as a sophisticated adult reader. Chapter books are, exactly as the name suggests, books designed at children aged roughly 6 to 9 that take a longer text and split it into short sections. This is a moment for any parent and any child of a different kind of reading, a book that is not necessarily completed in a single sitting or completed over and over again in a single sitting, but a book which takes its time, which can be spread out over several bedtimes, several days, several opportunities for reading. So chapters mark a kind of sophistication as a reader. They're about being able to hold a book, they're about being able to travel with it, they're about being able to pause with it, they're about being able to stop in those places marked out by author or printer or publisher, and then move on to the next section when we have the leisure, the space, the time, or the urge to do so. Chapters, of course, have also become part of our metaphorical or conceptual stock, as exemplified by the title of this year's Festival of Ideas, The Next Chapter. In this context, the next chapter seems always to offer promise. It's about looking forward. It's about going on to the next thing. It's about turning the page, turning over a new leaf, to use another bookish metaphor. It's the idea that there's something still to come and that we can look ahead to something which will be connected to but different from that which has gone before. It's a peculiarly then optimistic and perhaps simple metaphor given all that we've seen about the complexities of chapters and chaptering. Yes, chapters follow each other one after the next, but some writers choose to play around with the very structure of chapters, moving us backwards and forwards in time and space, asking us to shuffle the chapters ourselves, plunging us back into previous events, or pushing us forward to something entirely unexpected, even again, as in the case of Lewis Carroll, keeping us in exactly the same place as we were before. And the next chapter is always something that holds both promise and challenge. And we've seen all the way through this talk the ways in which writers thrive on that challenge, the way in which those writers who engage with chapters as a topic of fiction as well as a structure of the fictive book think about what it means to promise your reader something in a chapter, to promise to deliver something to your reader as a whole, and then to both fulfill and frustrate those expectations at the same time. The chapter's one of those parts of a book that we think about remarkably little, even as we use it, even as it's a fundamental part of our reading experience if we're reading any book that gives us the direction of stopping at the end of one part and pausing before we begin the next. But, as I hope this lecture has shown, it's a space and a structure full of creative possibility. Creative for the author, creative for printer and publisher, and creative too for the curious reader, keen to find out what's next.